On the morning of August 15th, 1827, Marsh Bend Plantation was silent. The kind of silence that presses on the skin. No birds, no wheels, not even the wind. Only the creak of old wood and the whisper of someone praying behind a door. When the overseer opened the library, he froze. Josiah Crane, master of Marsh Bend, lay on the floor. His skull was gone, shattered into ruin. The blow had been so strong that bone fragments were buried in his desk 6 feet away. The coroner's report was short. One line stood out. Injuries consistent with compression by hands of extraordinary size and strength. The name whispered that night was Sarah Drummond. She was no ghost story. She was real. 6 feet 8 inches tall, 240 pounds of muscle and silence. Her name lived in auction ledgers, in plantation records, in trembling testimonies written by men who feared her. Some called her a monster. Some called her Goliath's daughter. But she was only a woman who had been beaten too long. It began with a sale. Charleston, 1823. The auction house was full. The crowd stared at her like she was a myth. The auctioneer called her the Tall One. He said she could lift 2 men with one hand. When the bidding started, men shouted. One said she was cursed. Another said she was blessed. But to all of them, she was a price. Josiah Crane bought her for $1,300. When they chained her neck, she didn't cry, didn't beg. She just stared ahead with eyes like river stone. An old woman near the market whispered, "That man just bought his own death." Marsh Bend Plantation was hell made of water and mud. Snakes in the fields, fever in the air. Crane didn't buy her to work. He bought her to show. He would stand her on the veranda, make her lift barrels, make her hold out her hands so guests could measure them. A Charleston doctor wrote, "She lifted a 300-pound barrel as if it were nothing. I felt as though I had seen nature make a mistake." When she wasn't being shown, she worked the fields. Her strength made her valuable. Her silence made her dangerous. They whipped her. They locked her in the stocks. They tried to break her. They failed. She became the protector. They called her the Wall. She stepped between overseers and children. She carried the weak out of the swamps. She looked at cruelty and never blinked. Crane began to fear her. In 1824, he told her she would be sent to Charleston to be displayed. She looked at him and said, "I will not go." It took 8 men to drag her to the post. 30 lashes. She did not scream. She did not move. Crane thought he won. But something in her had changed. Something he could not touch. After that day, Marsh Bend grew quiet again. But the silence was different. He could feel it breathing. The children said she walked at night, that she stood at the river whispering to the water, that her reflection kept moving after she stopped. Crane pretended not to believe. But he knew. Deep down, he knew. The day he raised the whip, he had already begun to die, because some spirits, when pushed too far, don't break. They wait, and Sarah Drummond was waiting. The year was 1826. The rice fields burned gold under the sun, and the air hung heavy with rot and sweat. But something had changed inside the giant woman of Marsh Bend. Sarah Drummond was no longer a symbol of Crane's pride. She had become the one thing he feared most, a slave who no longer feared him. In the spring, she began to move differently. Slower, more careful. Her eyes were distant, her steps heavy. Soon the whispers started. The women said she was carrying life. The overseer laughed. But when her belly began to swell, no one laughed again. The father was Marcus, a carpenter with hands as quiet as his heart. He carved toys for the children. He prayed in silence. The 2 of them spoke little, but when they did, it was with eyes. When Crane found out, he saw profit, a child born from the strongest woman on the plantation. He could already hear the coins ringing in his head. He bragged to visitors, said he might breed a line of giants. Sarah stayed quiet, but inside, something began to twist. The child came on a cold January night in 1827. Her screams filled the cabin and echoed through the swamp. When it was over, she held a baby boy in her hands, Jacob, her only joy. For a few weeks, the cabin felt like a world apart. Marcus carved a wooden bird for Jacob. Sarah sang low, her voice deep like the river. Even the overseers walked softly near her door. but peace never lasts long in a house built on suffering. Crane's debts grew worse. His pride turned to anger. And then one morning, a stranger arrived. Nathaniel Gadsden, a trader who bought and sold human souls. He saw Sarah's child and smiled. "How much for the boy?" he asked. Crane hesitated. $400 was a fortune, but he nodded. A deal was made. That night, Sarah overheard them. She did not scream. She did not run. She just stood there holding her child, staring into the dark until dawn. Marcus came to her in silence. They both knew what would happen. He kissed Jacob's head. Then he left, carrying a letter sewn into his coat, a plea to anyone who would listen. He didn't make it far. They caught him by the river. Crane made an example of him. 50 lashes, the kind that tear a man's back open to the bone. The people were forced to watch. Sarah stood there, her face still, her child in her arms. Not a tear, not a sound. But her eyes, they were not human anymore. When it was done, Crane turned to her. "Tomorrow," he said, "the trader comes for your son. If you resist, I'll finish what I started with Marcus." That night she did not sleep. She sat in the dark, her son against her chest, whispering something no one could hear. At dawn, she rose, washed her hands, and went to work as if nothing had changed. When they came for her, she didn't fight. She walked into the master's house quietly, her face blank, her body still. Crane looked up from his desk. "Give the child to Mr. Gadsden," she whispered. "Please." "I will work harder. I will do anything," he sneered. "The matter is settled. Hand over the boy." Sarah kissed Jacob's forehead, then handed him to the trader. Her hands shook once, then went still. The moment the door closed, the house changed. The air grew heavy. The walls seemed to listen, because that was the moment Marsh Bend stopped being a plantation and became a grave. The plantation stretched for miles, a kingdom built on the backs of slaves. The owner, Charles Wainwright, ruled it like a tyrant. His cruelty had no limit. He believed fear was the only way to keep people obedient. But there was one woman who never bowed her head. Her name was Ada. The others whispered that she was Goliath's daughter. Charles hated that name. He saw her strength as a challenge to his power. He called her the Beast, never by her name. One night, a child spilled a jug of milk in the kitchen. Charles snapped. His rage turned toward Ada, who stood nearby. He raised his whip and struck her, once, twice, 3 times. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She just looked at him, eyes glowing in the dim lantern light. He struck again, but this time she caught the whip in her hand. The iron tip tore into her skin, but she didn't flinch. Her voice was low and calm. "Don't," she said. Charles froze. The silence in the room felt heavier than chains. He tried to speak, but she stepped closer. Her height, her shadow, swallowed him. "Every drop of blood you took," she whispered. "You'll repay tonight." Before he could shout for help, Ada grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off the ground. His eyes widened in disbelief as she squeezed. Bones cracked. The air filled with the sound of breaking glass and gasping breath. When it was over, Charles lay lifeless, his skull crushed in her bare hands. Ada looked at her palms, covered in blood, and whispered a single word: freedom. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields. The slaves gathered, silent, trembling. They didn't cheer. They didn't run. They only watched as Ada walked away into the storm. Some say she vanished that night. Others claim she was seen walking toward the river, her reflection taller than any human. But one thing is certain: from that night on, no master dared to raise a hand again on that land. The next morning, the plantation was silent. The birds didn't sing. The workers didn't move. Charles Wainwright's body lay on the parlor floor, his skull shattered like porcelain. When the sheriff arrived, he could hardly believe what he saw. A 6'8" woman born into slavery had done what no man ever dared. She had killed her master. The other slaves said nothing. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow. When asked where Ada went, they all gave the same answer. She walked into the storm. The sheriff sent a search party. They found footprints near the riverbank, deep, wide, and spaced like those of a giant. Then they stopped, fading into the muddy water. Some say she drowned herself. Others swear they saw her wading through the flood, her head above the waves, walking toward the dark horizon. That night, lightning struck the Wainwright house. Flames swallowed it whole. By morning, nothing remained but ash and the smell of burnt wood. Locals began to whisper. They said the land was cursed. They said the ghost of the giant woman still walked there, punishing cruel masters, freeing the oppressed. Years passed. The plantation was abandoned. Trees grew where fields once stretched. Yet travelers who passed through Alabama's lowlands spoke of strange sounds in the night. Heavy footsteps, distant cries, the echo of a woman's voice saying, "No more pain," and when storms came, people swore they saw her silhouette in the lightning, tall, unbroken, carrying a chain that glowed like fire. They called her many names. The giant of Alabama, the daughter of Goliath, the woman who fought God's battle. But those who knew her story used one name only: Ada, the woman who crushed her master's skull with her bare hand. The courtroom smelled of sweat and dust. Dozens of faces stared as she entered, shackled, her head almost scraping the door frame. The giant woman stood silent, her dark eyes fixed on the ground. Some whispered that she was not human. Others called her the devil's child. But most, deep inside, were terrified, because she had done what they all dreamed of doing. The master she killed had been a man of power. His name carried weight from one plantation to the next. When news spread that a slave woman had crushed his skull with her bare hands, white townsmen gathered with torches, shouting for her death. But no one dared approach her alone. It took 6 armed men and a chain thick as an anchor to bring her down. The judge looked at her and said, "You knew what you did?" She didn't answer. She just raised her head slowly, her eyes steady. Then she said the only words anyone ever heard from her lips. "He touched my sister." The room fell silent. The jury looked at each other, uncertain. The judge's gavel struck hard. The trial was over before it began. She was sentenced to death by hanging. They said she showed no fear. She refused food, refused prayer, refused tears. When the preacher came to ask for her confession, she simply stared out the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. The preacher wrote later in his diary, "I saw no evil in her eyes, only judgment." On the morning of her execution, hundreds gathered at the gallows. Some came for justice. Some came for fear. Some came for the thrill of seeing the giant woman who crushed a man's skull with her hands. They tied her wrists, though they knew she wouldn't resist. They had reinforced the platform with iron beams. They had crafted the rope extra thick. Even so, the hangman whispered to the sheriff, "This won't hold her." When she stepped onto the wooden platform, the crowd fell silent. She looked out at the horizon, at the fields where she once worked, at the river that ran behind the plantation. Then she said, "You cannot hang what's already free." The trapdoor opened. The rope snapped. Her body fell, hit the ground, and the crowd screamed. The hangman backed away, trembling. The sheriff shouted, "Do it again!" They tied another rope, stronger this time. But before they could lift her, thunder cracked. Rain began to pour, drenching the gallows, washing the dust from her skin. Someone shouted, "It's a sign!" Another said, "She's cursed." The crowd scattered in panic. The sheriff tried to pull her up again, but lightning struck a nearby tree, splitting it in half. The fire that followed was brief but bright enough to reveal her face, calm, peaceful, untouched by fear. By nightfall, her body disappeared. Some said abolitionists took her and buried her near the river. Others claimed her body burned in the fire. But a few swore she walked away in the rain, her chains broken, her steps echoing across the soaked fields. In the years that followed, whispers spread through Alabama. Field workers claimed to see a tall figure wandering the plantations at dusk, barefoot, her head covered in cloth, her hands stained red. Children were told to stay indoors when the wind howled, because that was the sound of her voice, crying for the sister she couldn't save. Decades later, after the war ended and freedom came, an old woman was found near the ruins of a plantation. She was over 7 feet tall, her hair white, her skin scarred. When asked her name, she said softly, I had one once, but they took it. She refused shelter and food. She only asked for a grave by the river. When she died, no one came to claim her. They buried her in silence. On her tombstone, someone carved 3 words. She stood tall. But that wasn't the end. In the archives of Mobile, Alabama, historians found a record written in the handwriting of a local sheriff dated 1836. It said, "The woman known as Goliath's daughter did not die on the gallows. Her rope failed. Her body vanished that same night. I saw her eyes in the storm. They were not the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of justice." That document vanished years later, stolen or destroyed, yet the legend lived on. Today, locals say if you stand by the old riverbank on a stormy night, you can still hear the sound of chains dragging through the mud. Some claim to see her reflection in the water, tall and silent, watching. Others believe she guards the graves of those who never had one. Historians still debate if she ever truly existed. Some say her story was invented to terrify slave owners, a warning that one day their victims would rise. But the details were too precise, the accounts too consistent. One witness, a former overseer, wrote before his death, "I saw her lift a man like he was straw. I saw her eyes when she did it. They were not wild. They were awake. In truth, it doesn't matter if she lived or not. What matters is what she became, a symbol of defiance in a time when silence was survival." They called her a monster, but in her story, the monster was never her. She was the echo of every cry ignored, the answer to every cruelty left unpunished. A woman of impossible height, impossible strength, and a heart that refused to bow. They say justice is blind. But that day in the storm, justice had a face, and it belonged to Goliath's daughter.